In the name of God, our Creator, Redeemer, and our Sustainer. Amen. I did not have an easy childhood. Well, no, let me correct that. I actually had a very happy childhood, filled with bike riding and baseball and bedtime stories and numerous trips to the ocean. But during that time, in retrospect, I was, by and large, shielded, as were my younger brother and older sister, though I think she soon enough became aware of just how difficult it was for my parents to keep us all above water. My mom worked, which was unusual for the late 50s and early 60s. I seem to recall that she did secretarial work for a welding company, then went on to work for the state of Maryland as a caseworker for the Department of Social Services, actually serving in South Baltimore, where both she and my dad were born and raised, and where I live now, and even having some distant relatives as clients, including my great-uncle Pat on my dad's side, who, in my family, at least on that Irish side of it, is the stuff of legend and at least worth mentioning as an aside to this story. He was the epitome. He was the quintessential old-world Irishman who could never say no to a pint. Was also full of superstition and largely responsible for reinforcing in me my belief in ghosts and other worldly spirits. I swear his picture appears in the Urban Dictionary next to the phrase piece of work. He claimed that as a boy he would hear the banshee regularly wailing in his neighborhood just before someone died. And later in life he would not enter my grandmother's house after her death because he always saw Annie sitting there in her rocker by the window and just couldn't bear the sight of her. There was also a story about a phantom cat, familiars and other pukas being what they are, but that will have to wait. My dad, when I was very young, was a traveling salesman for McCormick and Company. And there's some great memories there, even one I shared with you long ago in a sermon about a Christmas party thrown for all the employees and their families at McCormick. I remember that occasionally he would take me out of school. I was in elementary school at the time, and we would go on day trips, for his work into Delaware or central Pennsylvania, as far away as that exotic port of call on the Susquehanna known as Harrisburg. I vaguely remember the stores that we would visit as he sold McCormick spices to family groceries and smaller local chains. But I do remember the great lunches, especially those times we would stop at the Glass Kitchen in Wilmington, Delaware, the place that made me forever fall in love with the hamburger and with dill pickle slices. It went unnoticed by me when my dad suffered a nervous breakdown. As I said, this was all hidden from us. His absence, rather brief, and I didn't even remember it, my sister had to remind me of it, was explained as a business trip. But again, I did not realize until much later how difficult it was for him to function during this time, or that he was on medication. I did not realize right away that he had lost his job, which also meant that we lost the car that he drove, courtesy of McCormick and Company. I was about 9 or 10, and still blissfully naive because our family life never missed a beat. I was also unaware of the stressors that led to this in the first place. When my family moved out of South Baltimore to a single-family home where I grew up in the wonderful community of Hamilton, where my daughter lives now, by the way, and I was only 1 at the time, so I have no recollection of the move. But at that time, we also took in my great-aunt and uncle, a sister of my maternal grandmother, both retired, both on Social Security, and both in poor health. But my parents would never turn their back on a family member in need. They also took on a boarder who stayed in our spare bedroom. The extra income was certainly welcomed in managing the house and the 4 children that comprised our family. And as I said, it provided the means for a modest but very happy childhood. But I learned only later that my great-aunt and uncle also brought with them some overwhelming debt, a part of the reason they had needed shelter in the first place. And my parents tried to help them in reducing those obligations, taking out what was the equivalent of a home equity loan in those days. That compounded with some other bad decisions about repairs to the house. Still, we held on. But our boarder died suddenly, and my great aunt and uncle soon followed, and the revenue stream was gone. But the debt remained, and the financial stresses grew to be too much, hence my dad's issues. By the time I reached middle school, my dad was back to work. I remember he would take the bus downtown to work the 4 to 11 shift at Church Hospital in East Baltimore. All of this was not enough to save our house, though, as they tried to catch up on past mortgage payments and other loan issues. And when I turned 14 that summer, as I also shared in a sermon years ago, I found myself technically homeless. Although we did move in right away with an aunt who had us there for a month or two, storing as much as we could in her garage and basement while my parents recouped some dollars and found us a house to rent. But our recovery was slow. There was always a bill or two that did not get paid, so we got used to spending a few days without heat or without our phone. But we still rolled on, made the best of it. We laughed it off. It's where I honed my gallows humor. And we never let it beat us down. Still, there was one particular Christmas when it did finally catch me. My sister was in college at the time, and the first in our family to do so. I mean, of all of my aunts and uncles and cousins, my sister was the first. And me, I was in high school, and soon to become the next to follow her to a degree and beyond. And we both had jobs. We worked after school and on weekend. And since paying my sister's education was a high priority for my parents, we all had a stake in the finances for the family. We all mucked in and gladly. But I remember it was the year 1967, that Christmas. I was a junior in high school. And the money that my sister and I were earning that fall was put toward providing a worthy Christmas for our younger brothers, who would have been 11 and 4, and for getting the tree, and securing the feast, and providing the kind of Christmas we were accustomed to when we were that age. And while I might have felt good about what I was doing, I know that's the memory, I also recall resenting having to do it, and the anger I felt at how unfair life was at the time and how sorry I felt for myself. For instance, I wanted to learn to drive, but we had no car. And I had just lost a girlfriend at Thanksgiving to boot, in part because I could not afford to be dating her. And without wheels, it was hard to go see her. It's strange when your date arrives and leaves in a cab. But I realized looking back that what got me through it all in the end was precisely that bond that we had as a family. That, and we never lost our sense of humor. But it was also the hope and confidence that I still had for the future, which was instilled in me by the love and encouragement offered by my mom and dad, with which they were lavishly generous. And it was those moments of light that I experienced on that Christmas Eve and the following morning, as I watched my baby brother open his presents, as blissfully unaware of the situation as I had been at his age. Perhaps I should have nicknamed him Cindy Lou for that famous Who. But to the point, what was a dark season and a difficult time for me and my family did not provide the narrative for the rest of my life, or any of our lives for that matter. Love and hope changed the script that might have been written. I emerged from that stage of my life with a real optimism and with great anticipation for what lay ahead. This is a dark Christmas for us. It's not the one we imagined even as late as March or April or into May, when we thought the worst was over and that by summer we'd be back to some level of normalcy. Instead, we enter this Christmas experiencing the worst of the pandemic so far, which forces us to hunker down once again to spend holidays without quite so many family and friends that are dear to us, drawing near to us. and doing so with the knowledge that it's likely going to get far worse before it gets better. And that in part due to the sad fact that many still refuse to take this pandemic seriously. On top of that, our nation is forced to endure daily this spectacle that defies description, but that is only serving to stretch and strain to breaking the last bonds of friendship and respect and decency that by some miracle still might save us. And though we might put on a good face at home or on Zoom or Facebook or in our texts, it is in those unguarded moments that the real weight of this settles in. It is in those times that we fully understand the price we have paid these long months, emotionally, psychologically, and physically, perhaps even spiritually. As some days seem to last weeks, while at other times months have slipped by in what seems just like a weekend. Just a few days. Days which our minds and bodies tell us are getting shorter. We don't need to look at clock and calendar to figure that out. We can sense it, along with the growing darkness that feels as if it is closing in around us. I often talk about the intentional darkness of Advent and how God uses His time to shape us, to shake us, to prepare us. How from deep within the darkness, God calls us to wrestle with it spiritually, all the while anticipating the dawn of a new day, a new age. Third Isaiah, which Cheryl read for us this morning. That prophet knew about the darkness and about uncertainty and about longing. That prophet also understood the effect it had had on his people, for whom the weight of exile wasn't for a year or three, but for multiple generations, during which time many had lost hope, acclimating to the new Babylonian culture, while some had integrated so fully into it they would never ever think of returning to Jerusalem again. But to those who remembered, to those long-suffering, to those for whom the dream was still alive, for whom the light had not yet gone completely out, to those who did return to face the incredibly overwhelming task of rebuilding the walls of the city and raising once again the temple, and yet who still had not been able to stand up straight from the unbearable weight of exile. And hearkening back to the Jubilee year described in Leviticus, that year of release to those who had long suffered under the oppressive systems concocted by their forebears. Into all of this, the prophet boldly proclaims in this text the year of the Lord's favor, and with all the trimmings. Good news to the oppressed, liberty to the captives, release of prisoners, the binding up of broken hearts, and comfort to all who mourn. And boldly proclaims that in spite of the evidence, that day is now. The longing and disappointment and frustration and the pain of every moment before this one were not going to provide the narrative for what followed. Starting here and now up was the only way to go, and the God who had restored them and sustained them was ready to bless their every effort. I also often remark that this was not where I thought I was going to be when I headed into a sermon and began to play with these texts earlier in the week. But I know personally the weight that Isaiah seeks to lift from his people. We all know it. And right now I imagine we all feel it keenly. And like those in Isaiah's audience who felt as if they were in perpetual exile, it struck me that more than anything else today we just needed to hear that there is still reason to hope, reason to look expectantly for the light to return, and to be confident that it will. Hey, even John the Baptist makes a second trip to the lectionary this Advent just to remind us that the light is coming, that we can count on it. And yes, there are some tough days ahead. There are some things looming perhaps that we could not even imagine. But like that kid in high school having a tough Christmas, there is a bond that we have with each other, and the love that we share with each other that picking up each other when we need a friend or a prayer or a good word or when even more is needed. This is the thing that sustains us. Just as our continuing care for those beyond our walls further defines and helps us to grow and gives us the strength and resolve to do even more. So I'm going to save the prophetic words for next week. Besides the Magnificat, what low-hanging fruit that yields some fertile ground for that. But for now, just let me say that in spite of the evidence to the contrary, we've got this. God has this. And even though the tunnel is a bit longer than we bargained for, we know what to do. Like my family, we have not missed a beat, and we are not going to. And the grace that has brought us to this moment and the reservoir of love that we draw from, trust me, will be enough to sustain us. And that is going to be the narrative that carries us into the future. That is the script that we are writing for ourselves, and which will free us to look to what lies ahead with great anticipation. So as Paul says in his closing remarks to the community in Thessalonica, rejoice always. Give thanks in all circumstances. Hold fast to what is good. And dare to focus your eyes on the light of the coming dawn. Amen.